I think I'm going to take a moment now and I'm going to introduce the next speaker in our morning plenary session. And again, this workshop is really about driving thinking, highlighting success stories, and motivating action. And our next speaker is certainly someone that knows about action and knows about getting things done. Andrew McElwaine is the new president of the American Farmland Trust. Andrew has a very rich background in these issues that we're here discussing today. Andrew was most recently the president and CEO of the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, located in Naples. While he was in Florida at the Conservancy, he helped lead a successful state campaign for a state constitutional amendment to reduce property taxes on land that was permanently protected, and sought solutions to Florida's water and growth management problems. The Conservancy that he was with managed over 25,000 acres of permanently protected land. Prior to being there, he was the president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Environmental Council. And as the president of the council, he co-chaired two successful statewide bond initiatives that generated over $1 billion in conservation financing. Prior to being at the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, Andrew was the director of environmental programs at the Pittsburgh-based Heinz Endowments, was a staff member on President George Bush's Commission on Environmental Quality, and a senior legislative assistant to the late U.S. Senator John Heinz. So Andrew just joined AFT less than 6 months ago. As someone that works in my capacity, you're always happy to see your boss visit. And I will say that when Andrew came to AFT, he recognized that New York was on the progressive front of many of these issues across the country. And I'm very happy to say that Andrew's already in his first few months here been in New York 3 times and visiting farms in the Hudson Valley, been meeting with leaders in New York City, and I'm very much looking forward to touring with Andrew to see other parts of New York State and see the tremendous wealth of partners and leaders that we have here in this state. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Andrew McElwaine.
Thank you very much, David, and it's humbling to be on the street named for one of our staff people, Laura Tennant. So that's quite an honor. Maybe it was your day. But I think that gives you a sense of the deep roots that this organization has in New York. We were founded 34 years ago when people from all over the country, New Yorkers, including Julia's family, and also many others, came together and looked at the loss of our most productive farmland to urban sprawl and overdevelopment, and the environmental and economic problems that conversion resulted in, and felt they needed an organization that could work at the national level and at the regional level to address the loss of such a precious natural resource. And so delighted to be here 34 years later, and also only the 3rd president of the organization in the last 27 years. So and quite an honor to be associated with you. I want to thank David and Laura for all the good work they did in pulling this together. As David mentioned, I used to run a conservancy that covered South Florida, and when I went out this morning to look around and maybe get some little exercise, I was thinking, gee, maybe that wasn't such a bad job. But I am delighted to be in a state that is in many ways progressive on promoting new local and regional opportunities for agriculture. I'm also impressed and delighted by the turnout. It reminds me of something that New York Yankees catcher Yogi Berra once said, which is nobody goes there anymore, it's just too crowded. So thank you all for your time and attention today. It's gratifying and humbling to see so many of you who are so anxious to work on some very difficult issues. And let me say that we are working, those of us who are in the field, as we all are, of farmland protection, we are working with some very difficult issues. We have found from the U.S. Department of Agriculture that every acre of U.S. farmland lost to development requires 3 to 6 acres elsewhere in the world to be converted into agriculture and make up for the lost production. And repeated studies show that in the developing world, most land converted to agriculture is coming at the expense of tropical forests. Between 2000 and 2012, global deforestation occurred on 580,000 square miles, an area larger than the state of Alaska. Global food production at the same time, according to the FAO, needs to increase 70% by 2050 in order to keep up with population growth, and 40% has to come from the United States. 90% of the world's arable land is already in agricultural production. But farmland protection is more than just food. It is also a major part of other solutions. For instance, urban land emits 75 times the CO2 of farmland. And at the same time, we're losing local and regional farmland. We face an epidemic of childhood diabetes and childhood obesity from unhealthy food and from lack of adequate nutrition and exercise. Unfortunately, farmland protection is not keeping up with the needs we have. Since 1980, nearly an acre of farmland has been lost to development every year. A total of 21 million acres of productive farmland has been consumed in that time period. And 37% of the total is prime farmland, often adjacent to new urbanizing areas. This creates what David and I call farming on the edge. And many states, during the recession, suspended or even eliminated funding for farmland preservation. And the pending Farm Bill in Washington that was working on yesterday on Capitol Hill, it would cut between $3.5 and $5 billion from federal support for conservation, a 5 to 8% reduction, which does not include the sequester that will happen in January unless Congress does something about its budget, which I'm not holding my breath for, by the way. We have wonderful opportunities, particularly here in New York, to promote local food systems and protect food sheds. However, nationally, local food systems are only 2% of farm production, 2% of the market. And so we have both an opportunity, but a challenge in taking it from a niche market into a more general economic vehicle. Now, if in terms of the environment and the environmental benefits and environmental challenges of farmland, if someone asked you whether you could protect your most valuable asset, reduce your pollution levels, and increase your long-term productivity, would you do it? And simply put, too many have not. No civilization has ever survived the loss of soil health and soil productivity. Between 1982 and 2007, every year we lost 1.7 billion tons of farm soil to erosion and sedimentation, reducing the amount of food we can produce and wreaking havoc on rivers, bays, and estuaries downstream. For this reason, AFT has successfully gotten the Senate, but not the House, to require conservation compliance for federal crop insurance. And that is one of our big issues in order to prevent that continued loss. At the same time, farmers are over-fertilizing their crops and leaving too much animal waste, potentially valuable fertilizer and commodity, unreclaimed. And they watch as those expensive resources and assets wash away with every rain, contributing to poor water quality. Few environmental problems can be corrected while also creating value and reducing business costs. But for farmers who cut their nutrient pollution, they can do both and do so easily. Healthy soils sequester carbon and hold it, while decaying soils release the CO2 they hold. In other words, agriculture is far easier to achieve environmental improvement on than more sewage treatment plants and more industrial treatment to attempt to achieve the same goal. And we face a challenge, which New York is addressing, of intergenerational transfer of land. Simply put, too many family farms are unlikely to be farmed by that family as the majority of the country's land mass turns over in the next 10 to 15 years to inheritors and heirs. Several challenges. One is, if not now, within the next few years, women will be the largest owners of family and individual farms. Women are more likely, based on research and surveys we've done, to adopt conservation practices. However, our conservation strategies continue to be based on a 1960s model, which does not recognize the changing demographic of our agricultural sector, and is not based again on surveys and research done by our staff, is not conducive to serving the needs of women in agriculture. We also are seeing, as the land changes hands, a rapid increase in the amount of farmland being leased outside the family. And those who rent their land have far fewer incentives to conserve it than the actual owner operator. So how do we reach those who hold those leases and those who farm it under lease in order to promote sound and healthy environmental and agricultural practices? And then lastly, young farmers. As New York farmland prices have gone up, how can new farmers access the market? And here is a place that I think New York is doing very, very well. We find some things here that New York is a leader in, particularly the farmland programs and efforts to tie new farmers to those who want to lease or sell their land, and create a system by which new farmers can access farmland. We find New York doing well in local food systems, in creating particularly a vibrant farm-to-institution program that David mentioned in his talk. I believe that is a model that needs to be followed elsewhere in the country. It is a leader in environment and agriculture, particularly the Agricultural Watershed Council in the Hudson and New York area, in which we found that it was far cheaper and far more effective to address New York's water quality problems through farmland protection and farmland conservation than it is to build the great pyramids of wastewater treatment in an attempt to address the same problem and do it less effectively. Now, however, New York is not a leader in any way on farmland protection. Compared to Pennsylvania, 485,000 acres in your neighboring state have been permanently protected through state investment. A total of $800 million from that state has gone into farmland protection over the last 20 years. New York is 1/5 of the amount of land preserved and 1/8 of the amount of money invested by comparison. New York is a follower when it comes to farmland protection through state intervention. And I challenge New York and I challenge the legislature to follow what its neighbors are doing, to catch up on farmland protection. New York can and I hope will be a leader in environmental protection in all areas. New York's agricultural sector is a $46 billion a year industry. At the same time, it is a challenge, challenged by sprawl, challenged by environmental problems, and challenged in terms of finding markets that can help them diversify away from the traditional resource-intense and environmentally damaging way of doing business. So with your help, that of our partners, the leadership of the many groups here today, we hope and expect that New York will be a model for the rest of the country when it comes to farmland protection, local food systems, and the intergenerational transfer of agricultural land. David said that if there are questions, that I can be fairly beaten up. So, David, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you. So I guess this is the fun part of being a little tall and only having one microphone that's fixed in place.
That's why I'm up here.
So what we want to do is take a few minutes to have some Q&A, have some conversation with all of you. So are there any of you that have questions? There are things that you think are something that you wanted to hear from Andrew about?
Could you explain a little bit more about the intergenerational transfer issues and your findings specifically?
Yes. What we're finding on intergenerational transfer coming from the Agricultural Statistics Service and the natural resource inventories conducted by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the expectation is the majority of our land mass that's in agriculture today will pass from one generation to the other within the next 15 years. Or in some cases, it will pass from a spouse to another spouse. The result will be potentially a game changer for agriculture. Particularly, we only expect about 50 to 60% of that farmland to continue to be actively farmed by the family. And so how do we reach those who, like my mother-in-law, who in her 80s is an owner of farmland outside Virginia, Illinois, how do we reach her with a conservation and protection message? Fortunately, her land is leased to someone she trusts and who has been a good manager. However, that won't always be the case. What we're also finding in some of the areas, so-called farming on the edge, is there is a tremendous demand for experienced farm managers. The cost of hiring such people is going through the roof as more and more people are no longer actively farming. So that's a major challenge. How, as people are less connected to their land, how can we ensure that environmental safeguards, soil health? I mentioned earlier, it's believed now that the Mayan civilization failed because of loss of soil health. No civilization has ever survived that lost that health. How can we address these concerns through these contractual relationships that we see expanding in our country?
Yeah, I'll just chime in one thing on that front. Here in New York, we have a little bit over 9,000 farmers that are over 65, according to the Census of Agriculture. They manage about 1.8 million acres of agricultural land. Their economic impact, even the farm sales of those farmers, about $800 million a year. So, I mean, significant footprint in terms of the landscape and significant economic impact in terms of farm economy. How many of them have successors within the family? Those a little bit harder to tease out some of those numbers. I think, as Andrew suggests, you could, basic demographics would make us believe they're going to be transitioning out, and so the challenge is how do we help that new generation looking to get in. And the good news is that there is a lot of interest in people that want to get into agriculture, and some of them are young, some of them are mid-career, second, third, fourth career, veterans, immigrants. There's a healthy population of people that want to get into agriculture, and I think the challenge is, how do we break down the barriers that stand in the way of that next generation, while also helping the people that are farming today, the landowners that are out on that landscape today, how do we help them succeed in transferring their farms? Because we know that one of the places where we've lost the most farms to development is in that failed transfer process. That is one of the primary drivers of the loss of farmland in this state. So it's a
That's national. I would just add that that's what we're seeing nationally, particularly in the so-called farming on the edge, where there's a real opportunity to bail and sell your land for development.
Other questions? Craig?
Andrew, could you speak more to how Pennsylvania attached
Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, I better repeat the question. So how did Pennsylvania, which is not an early adopter in some cases, David's laughing, become one of the nation's leaders in farmland protection? Is that right? Or
Yes.
is there more specifics that you want? Really, it was driven by an unusual partnership between suburban Democrats and rural Republicans who both saw what was happening to the farm systems between Philadelphia and Harrisburg, the immense loss of development, the loss of the beauty, the health, and the permanence of that land base. And they came together. The Democratic chair of the House Agriculture Committee, the Republican chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee, one from the very conservative Lancaster area, another from the much more moderated Philly suburbs. And first they did a $100 million bond issue for farmland preservation. After that, they dedicated a portion of the cigarette tax to farmland preservation. And then finally, on 2 occasions, which I was directly involved in, we passed environmental quality and ag preservation bond issues, total of over $1 billion. And David, I believe about $250,000 of that went to farmland preservation, some are $200 million.
About that, yeah.
And just so David Heston, former Secretary of Environmental Protection for the state of Pennsylvania, is here operating in his moonlighting job of videographer. So again, the specifics, just so you know, Dave was executive director of the State Senate Energy Environment Committee when the ball got rolling, and really is someone that if you want to talk tactics and strategy, he's quite a resource to you.
So we're talking a little bit about Pennsylvania, and you're talking about development and coaching on farmland. What about extraction industries and some of the farmland that's been preserved being used for extraction industry type stuff? And does that still count as farmland? And is that
Great question. Great question. Does in terms, I assume we were talking natural gas.
That's what I'm talking about.
Okay, natural gas on protected farmland. Let me say that to me, and maybe I'm just a fossil rather than a fossil fuel. When you put an easement in your land that says no development, that means no development. And if when you're drilling for natural gas, I'm not necessarily opposed to natural gas production, but when you put a pad in a road and all the infrastructure, storage tanks and everything else on something that has an easement that says no development, I'm sorry, you need to go after that. And that is development in my mind. And I don't believe unless some of the really early easements from Ames may be so poorly written. I've seen a number of them. I've had to defend some of them, it's no fun. You may have enough weasel room in it to get around that, but a modern easement should never allow that.
As long as you're on that topic.
Yes, ma'am.
I constantly am asked by people, and I try to explain it, and I don't know if I do a good job. We cannot reverse, and cannot explain it.
Cannot reverse,
I try to
I'm sorry.
explain it to people that constantly ask me, well, can't they, reverse a purchase of development right? And I'm like, no, it doesn't work that way, but I'm not going to explain it.
Well, there are only a few ways to reverse it. An easement can be reversed by condemnation. And that is something that I've seen, I've fought against over the years running conservancies and environmental organizations, and generally lost. So, again, public condemnation of easement is possible. The other thing I've seen is caution against doing this. In some states, they allow temporary easements, 15, 20 years, and really I think that does kind of defeat the purpose of protection to some extent. So that's something I would be very cautious about.
My question is about collaborative partnerships, both in protecting farmland but also on legislative activity. Can you talk a little bit about that role that plays and maybe the breadth that we should think about that?
Yeah, I think it Again, the Pennsylvania example is a little bit instructive in which rural and suburban and groups came together. But more importantly, I think looking at the success of the two bond issues that we did in Pennsylvania, there was a little bit in it, there was a little bit in it for everybody. We had, we had fish commission to replace old infrastructure that the Anglican community, the hook and bullet crowd wanted. We had some game land issues in there that helped again bring the rural constituency on. We had watershed work with agriculture, and we really created it. And I would take a look at the so-called Growing Greener Coalition in Pennsylvania, just how broad it is. Agriculture was about a fifth of the funding in there. But that very broad coalition was the reason we got it passed. And let me just add that Dave, state legislature gave us 1 point. They authorized putting it on the ballot. They gave us 6 weeks to take it. The election was 6 weeks after they passed it, and it was an off-year primary ballot. Low turnout, super voters only. We had 6 weeks as the conservation community to put a coalition together and pass it. And I think probably the Pittsburgh mayoral primary saved where we were in. If we passed it with 60% of the vote, there was just nothing on the ballot anywhere else in the state to bring people to the polls. So again, it testifies to the strength of that coalition, the diversity of interests that, we couldn't increase the amount of money. We had a set amount that the legislature authorized. But we had it was for so many different things that people cared about that the whole state rallied around it. Dave, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to add was that there were two growing greeners. The first one, the main funding source was a $4.25 per ton fee on municipal waste disposed in Pennsylvania. And I want to thank New York in particular for contributing to that, because you have probably the biggest chunk of waste besides New Jersey coming into Pennsylvania. So thank you very much. The second round was a bond issue that Andrew was talking about, and Andrew's correct. It had a number of different things. Reclaiming abandoned mines in Pennsylvania is huge, and that was a big piece of it. So, everything from abandoned mines to farmlands to recreation projects all got funded in Growing Greener 1 with the fee and Growing Greener 2 with the bond issue.
So again, without that coalition, nothing would have happened.
I just want to add one thing from the New York perspective on the partnership issue. If you look back to the early 80s, we were losing a farm every 3.5 days here to real estate development. If you look back to the early 80s, according to USDA, almost 5,000 farms were paved over here in New York State. That's the bad news. The good news is, if you looked at the most recent 5-year chunk of time that USDA has tracked, from 2002 to 2007, we've cut that rate of loss in half. And so we were at a place where for every farm we protected, we were losing 10. And I think it is very possible that in the next 10 years that we could completely reverse that, so that we are actually protecting more farms than we are losing. And I think when you look at how that's going to happen, it's because of partnerships of people like this, people in this room. It's going to happen because we're going to have more people getting engaged in permanently protecting farmland. That's got to be a piece of the puzzle. Secondly, we're going to have more people engaged at a local level on land use planning, and not driving development onto our farms, and that's a piece of the puzzle. But then thirdly, we've got to have more economic opportunities for our farmers. And part of the reason that we were losing those farms is because there just was not enough money coming into the family. And then lastly, we need that next generation to come onto the farm. So when I think about the types of partnerships that you posed to Andrew, people in this room are the next generation of those types of partnerships that are going to make it possible for us to actually stop the loss of farmland here in New York State. That is a very real, a very achievable future here.
One other item that David's colleague on the West Coast, Ed Thompson, has been pursuing legislation that is farmland mitigation. That is to say, for every acre of farmland lost to development, there needs to be a conservation easement on another acre. A interesting solution. I don't know if the legislature's going to enact it. Certainly it's gotten people's attention. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask a question about, well, discuss a little bit and ask a question about the economics of the farm Steve just mentioned. And that is, sir, you said that New York State is way behind our neighbors in saving the farmland and I guess in the acceleration of loss of farmland at the same time.
Just on the protection, not necessarily of the laws.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, I'm wondering if, and entertaining the concept of economics, if there was more of a focus on the diversity of farming in the state, whether you would recognize that as a first move towards the saving of farmland. And what I mean by that is like increasing the value of the production of the farm. And as an example, I'd like to entertain the concept of diversing ag acreage from commodity animal feed production, which include hay, corn, and soybeans as a mainstay, to production of cereal grains for human consumption, which would raise the value of the product that the farms are producing, and also help to engage the tremendous increasing demand of grains for human consumption in our region.
It's an interesting idea, and I need to do a little more homework than I can do with my addled mind this morning. But you know, one of the challenges I would see, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. You know, your largest product by far is dairy, and it's about $3 billion all by itself, and those critters have to eat something. And if my question for you would be, if we take land out of production of their feed, you know, it will come from somewhere else. I don't see the dairy industry going away in New York, at least not right away. So where would that come from, at what cost, and what would you know, in terms of those who need or buy milk, what would happen to them on prices? It's interesting. I just would need to think through all the concepts.
I understand that's a logical response. But what I'm thinking of is that so much of the dairy industry grows grains for animal consumption. If they were to diverse and start growing grains for human consumption as a sideline on their farm, increasing the acreage that they're growing even, and but diversing into that would give them a larger bang for their buck for what they're producing. It'll also create income that's not locked into the milk check, which is a serious problem.
Yep.
And so it'll diverse them and allow them to have income on their farm from their land and not tied into the milk check. And at the same time feeding their neighbors.
But without them having to ship in corn from Illinois at higher cost to replace the loss of feed. Okay, well, yeah, as long as that latter point doesn't happen, if you're not becoming dependent on overseas for farming.
That's extreme.
Yeah, for feeding animals. Yeah, it sounds intriguing to me.
So I guess I'll just point out that we have a session this afternoon called Preparing Farmers for Expanding Local Markets, and we're actually going to have a panel of farmers that are going to talk about where they see economic opportunity in local markets, and really what are the things they need to do, or where can they use support in really tapping into those emerging markets. So I think the questions you're asking are interesting ones. I know there are other partners in the room here that are looking into grains specifically, and so I encourage you to seek out that third session, session 1C. Great place to explore the questions.
Any questions? You go.
Yeah, we do.
Yep.
What
Okay.
about the CSA model as a way to preserve farmland? In New York State, I would say New York is a leader with this type of model of farmland.
can talk about Florida agriculture, which I tangled with for the better part of a decade. It's a small farm in Florida, 50,000 acres, so we can talk about that offline. But CSA has tremendous opportunities. It's been around for 20 years as a model. I think the challenge to CSA and other models is getting out of the niche. And because all of local food system efforts, including CSA, amounts to only 2% of agricultural consumption right now, nationally. I don't know about you. So cracking out of that niche, just as renewables were a little niche of about 1% of electrical production, just as sustainable forestry was a niche with almost no market. Can we create community-supported agriculture on local things to break out of what's now a niche for people who really care, who want to do it, and create a viable market with the right incentives? And if New York's cracking that code, I'd love to learn more.
And I will say that, I joke that New York, I guess the Midwest is the breadbasket of America, that we're a food-producing state, so we might be the vegetable cart, the fruit cup, the milk jug, that we are a food-producing state with 19 million eaters and many more eaters right next door. So I think that notion of producing food for people nearby is absolutely a place of opportunity. That whole first track of workshops we're having today is really exploring one avenue towards that opportunity, and that's really working through institutions. And the institutions feed millions of New Yorkers, and so that is an avenue for that scale up. Certainly there are a lot of other models, though, and I know there's a lot of bright minds in this room that are actively pursuing some of those others.
Okay. Well, thank you all very, very much. It's an exciting day. Thank you all. Whoa, standing room now. It's really quite extraordinary. So thank you all for your interest. I'm certainly encouraged to see this big a group caring about these issues, trying to do something about it. So thank you.